Virginia, Mr. Riggleman is recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses here today. And I find this very interesting as we're talking about this, because we just had the mega bank witnesses not too long ago. And we were talking about in that hearing when we're talking about really wanting to stop stock buybacks, effectively curbing investment returns, private sector growth. And one of the reasons I ran, I've been in for 11 months now, so I have a lot of experience, but one of the reasons that I ran for Congress specifically was government overreach into my own businesses, but also to my wife and daughters. And this is why I'm so interested in what's going on here. When we talk about private equity, we're not just talking about large companies, pension funds, things of that nature, and I know we've mentioned this multiple times, but I wouldn't be here without private equity. First, my Department of Defense business, I had a $90,000 investment from private equity. We were able to turn that into a 60-time multiplier on gross revenues, where we had 20 direct employees and 50 subs. Now my wife owns a chemical manufacturing plant of distilled spirits, but anyhow, so the issue we had with private equity then is we couldn't get a bank loan. Even though this is what she wanted to do, we put a lot of our own money into it, but we couldn't get the banks. They did not know how to evaluate anything when it came to COGS, when it came to overhead, when it came to labor salaries, based on the fact that we had to build specific types of inventory that they had no way to evaluate as we went forward. So as we're going forward in this, what I always fear is that the government is another member or a board member on my company or another company. What I also fear is when you see legislation this bad, which I call the Stop Entrepreneurship Act, when you see legislation this bad, I'm wondering if it's individuals writing this with good intentions, not understanding the law of unintended consequences or the cascading effects of this type of damaging thing. Let me ask a question. I'll start with Mr. Palmer, go to Mr. Maloney. I'm talking about asymmetric companies, and I'm talking about companies that maybe are non-traditional. For example, when you start a niche company, say in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community space, you're talking about maybe companies that have a very specific niche thing that they do. They can't get a loan to start. They can't even get a loan for office space. Do you know where they have to go? Your own money or private equity. If you're starting a manufacturing plant and you're one of the first 3 or 4 to do it the way that you're doing it, say in a whole state that doesn't understand it, you cannot get a loan. You have to go to private equity. Now, you have to have, as you know, pro formas. You have to know what pro formas are and P&Ls. You have to know all that kind of, all those things. But I think that's why the first thing I want to do before I get to the questions, I want to, and this is a third-party report, Mr. Chairman, I want to submit the economic impact analysis of the Stop Wall Street Looting Act. I ask unanimous consent to put that, to actually record this, please. So my question is this. When we're talking about private equity, we're talking about the things that drive the American economy. My question is, what happens to asymmetric or non-traditional businesses, Mr. Palmer, if this bill passes or something like this passes?
They'll have less access to capital. Private equity fills those gaps that don't fit neatly for a simple bank loan.
So, so Mr. Maloney, same question.
I agree with Brett that it will dry up capital needed for these asymmetrical businesses.
So in this report that I'm going to put in, it says it could result in a loss of 6.2 million to 26.3 million jobs across the United States. That's a projection. You know what that should say? 6.2 million and 31. Because it's the 31 jobs in our manufacturing facility that we wouldn't have right now. It's the 70 total jobs and the multiple subcontracting companies that we had that would not be in business today. Now, I know it's not perfect. Trust me. I've dealt with private equity and venture firms. It's fantastic, and I would not recommend it to anyone. But anyhow, but I think what's amazing is that they were able to get us started, right? And they were able to do great things. And right now, if you talk about Charlottesville, Virginia, in my district, without them, without that angel network, I wouldn't have 31 employees. I wouldn't have, my wife wouldn't have locations in Virginia and Pennsylvania, and I would never have been able to even get to that point without private equity. I think as we go forward, and I had all these statistics that I wanted to throw out there, but I have 54 seconds, and if people knows about how fast I talk on data, we don't want to do that right now. This bill is not a law yet. And I think for me, as we're going forward, and some of the other questions I wanted to ask, and some of the things that blow my mind, if we actually, right now, if we were to do this, to actually create a loss of somewhere between $671 million to $3.36 billion per year, about half of which will be lost to pension fund retirees, I shudder to think that we're not going to go over this with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that we're not stopping the American economy in its tracks because we don't understand the law of unintended consequences, we don't understand cascading effects, and we don't understand the fact that government has no idea sometimes what it's doing in private business. That's all I have right now. Thank you, and I yield back my time.